Hey there. I wanted to start today by talking about the tarot deck that I've been using lately. I really enjoy these videos where people share their thoughts on various decks, and in the past several months, I've watched a ton of them. And this is because I have been yearning to branch out and get a new deck. But I ran into a fundamental issue, which is that I couldn't actually settle on any of the decks that I have seen. Oftentimes, I find that there are cards whose depictions I enjoy in whatever deck, and I fundamentally dislike others, and yet I have been using the same deck for a long time. That deck, of course, I'm familiar with the Rider-Waite, but the deck that I use most consistently, basically exclusively, because I'm very much a one deck kind of girl, is the Dragon Tarot, which is like this kitsch 90s deck, or actually it's older than that, I'm sure. It's just I got it in the 90s, so I think of it as being of that era. But I'm very, very familiar with this deck, and while it's based on the Rider-Waite, it's not a clone, and so I have certain feelings about certain cards that in my mind are represented in a very particular way, and although I'd like to branch out and explore those cards from different angles, I was unable to settle on any individual deck. Now, here's what I mean when I say that the cards have a very different tone. It's not a Rider-Waite clone. For instance, here before you, you've got the Nine of Wands in the Rider-Waite, and then in the Dragon Tarot. And in the Rider-Waite, you have this really distinct feel of, this person just having escaped conflict, of having set up barriers, of trying to protect oneself and doing what one can in order to ensure their own future well-being. Whereas within the Dragon Tarot, I really get the sense that this card essentially explores the facets of the Nine of Wands a little bit further down the road from a temporal standpoint. So here we have more of a feel of having come away from this conflict, but having now gotten to the point where we're no longer merely in a defensive position, but we've actually ascended and benefited from the source of this conflict. Same thing with, for instance, the Five of Wands. In the Rider-Waite, it's very clearly active conflict, but within the Dragon Tarot, I really feel that it's more like an examination of one's own baser nature. And so rather than there being actual fighting in the moment, you have this potential for conflict. You have a call to one's baser self, but also you really get the sense that the figure in the card is considering, is aware of these baser aspects, and is considering them, as opposed to having fallen prey to them. Finally, there are some cards that just feel wildly different to me. So the Nine of Cups is a key example, where in the Dragon Tarot, this card is just very sweet. It's very charming. This is the only card in the deck where you have this seahorse motif for the dragon, and you've got this happy little tail of a fish popping out of the water. This really invokes the sense of the weird for me, the strange, the freedom to be oneself. And although I can relate that to the Nine of Cups, which is more traditionally sort of being self-satisfied, almost selfish in one's position of success, the Nine of Cups in the Dragon Tarot I can think of as being the natural extension of that. Like, if I were to win the Nobel Prize, I would then just be completely ridiculous and eccentric, because once you've hit that point of success, you can do whatever the hell you want, right? So, and that's the feel I get from this card instead. So after having looked at many, many decks and watched many, many reviews, I decided to go a slightly different route. And this decision ultimately was precipitated by a really interesting experience I had in Circle, wherein I threw the cards during ritual, and rather than seeing the cards, I immediately found myself sort of sucked into them. It was dark enough that I was just pulled into the card and found myself scrying in the card surface. And only afterwards did I look at the name, the imagery on the card. And I thought it was a really fantastic and interesting experience. It ended up adding quite a lot to the read. I love this idea of fusing different forms of divination into one reading. And the scrying with the tarot thing was something I wanted to pursue more. I also, like I said, didn't want to be tied down to any individual imagery, and a lot of people deal with that by getting multiple decks and reading with whichever one feels right at whatever given time. I am one of these people who is deeply attached to working with one tool. I have one knife, I have one mortar and pestle. I technically have two tarot decks, the Rider-Waite and the Dragon Tarot, but I only use the Dragon Tarot and only have for a very long time. The Rider-Waite was my first deck, but it's not one I read with. So I wasn't willing to flip between decks, and I wanted to scry, and I wasn't deeply attached to any particular imagery that I saw in the existing decks, despite there being many beautiful decks. So I decided to go a slightly different route and make my own deck from a set, or two sets actually, of playing cards. So these are the cards. They are black PVC playing cards, from which I've built a standard 78 tarot. And these cards are called minim cards, and the minim references the fact that they have a very minimalistic style. So here, for instance, is the 5 of clubs, which I use as the 5 of coins. And all of the cards follow this motif. It's a solid black, vaguely matte background, making it ideal for scrying, that sort of classic featureless, solid colored surface. And what I have done is I've taken a couple of these decks and used them to make my own tarot. Now, I wasn't sure how this would work out, although I've used tarot for quite a while and I use it constantly. I wasn't sure whether I would actually be able to read with a deck that had no imagery in it. But what I was hoping, and what I did in fact find, was that I know the images on the Dragon Tarot. So when I see the Queen of Wands, I can immediately call to mind the image associated with that in the deck that I've been using for a long time. And therefore, it's as good as having the image printed on the card. But by using this particular deck, I can do all sorts of other things. So one of them is that now my intention is to go and learn imagery, examine imagery from all sorts of other decks without necessarily having to purchase them all, in order to get to explore different facets of the card than what is presented in the deck that I've been using thus far. And so, for instance, for the majors, the minors, it's pretty easy to do. You basically have an entire deck of playing cards that covers most of the minors. What you're missing is there are only, in a standard playing deck, 3 court cards per suit, right? So you would have to add another set of court cards. I just added another round of knights and then just sort of used black marker to color in a little part of that card in order to differentiate it from the other knights in the deck. For the majors, I've used a permanent marker, so in this case it's a copper Sharpie, just to write the number of the major on the card. And I will see if I can get this to show in the light, but you can see, maybe, let's see, there, yeah. So you can see that I've written in black permanent marker on the side a little cheat for myself, so justice, because despite having spent quite a lot of time reading tarot, I've never actually managed to commit to memory the number associated with the majors, and so that is something I'm working on. It's just not something I had paid attention to. So you can use the black permanent marker to write something subtly on the card. You can use a colored permanent marker or Sharpie to label the card semi-permanently. Now, one thing worth noting, because these are black PVC cards, it means that they can be washed, and you can also even remove permanent marker with a little bit of rubbing alcohol. So very easy to write on the cards and undo them. And so that's another major aspect of what I like about these cards. It's opened up all sorts of opportunities to do fun things and add new aspects to my reading. So, for instance, one option is, like many people, I keep a journal recording, my readings, but I don't necessarily always want to have to go back to that journal and look to check something that has happened in the past. So just say you feel like you've drawn judgment a lot lately. What you can do that's really fun is you can write on the card, just keep track of, let's say, in the past couple of weeks, I've pulled the card 6 times in a particular sort of reading. Now, in this case, for a lot of the marking up of the cards, we've got the permanent marker that I use to permanently label the card, as it were, although this will fade over time. But a more temporary writing option, which is still like robust enough to stay on the card, but that comes off with just a damp cloth, is actually this. It's a little bistro style chalk marker. So you can use this to write on the cards. Another one that I've done is I can use it to write my own associations with particular cards. So for instance, a past Wheel of the Year read, I did a combination of card pulling and scrying. And so here, for instance, I've written down that this is the card that I had associated with Letha. And it itself had been associated with imagery of ashes floating in the sky. That is something that I can write down on the card. In terms of other things to write on cards, I've also been really interested in the idea of including alchemical symbols that you can jot down on a card. If you're throwing tarot and, let's say, the astrological correspondences for the moment are Sagittarius, you could go through your deck and mark all of the cards that are associated with Sagittarius in some sense and make a note on the cards for as long as Sagittarius is around, and then as soon as we move on to something else, it's no longer relevant, no longer important. You can go in with your damp cloth, just wipe it away, and it's good as new. And yet, I can shuffle this deck with this bistro marker on it, and it will shuffle fine, it won't smudge terribly. If you use the bistro marker on any part of the card that you're going to be touching a great deal, you will get some smudging and everything, but it's remarkably stable considering how easy it is to then remove. Other options for writing with the cards that I will be exploring or have begun to explore are, let's say you're going to be doing several readings about particular individuals in your lives and you want to sort of assign cards to individuals within the deck. You could go ahead and jot that down and be like, okay, so this card here, the devil is going to be associated. Let's not do that one, just in case there is somebody watching. Okay, so let's skip death too. There we go. Okay, let's go with strength. How about that? Let's say the strength is going to be associated with my mother, and you can jot that down as a note on strength, and then over the next couple weeks, as you're throwing cards, that can essentially be a card that now has a new identity. So this, again, the Wheel of the Year card that I had labeled here, this is also a form of temporal labeling. So if this were to come up in a spread, I then immediately know, okay, so this is the card that I associated with Letha. The Four of Wands has its own particular meanings and correspondences, but in addition to that, it's associated with what I saw during the Wheel of the Year spread and what that meant to me. In addition to that, it might also serve as a temporal marker, so something that is coming around the time of Letha or something that will become relevant again during that time. So it really allows you to personalize the cards across reads and in a way that is immediately visible and immediately accessible while you're throwing the cards, so that you don't have to run back to your journal and cross-check 28 pages to make sure that you've got all that information and you're not forgetting anything. Another one that I quite enjoy, something that I'm going to be playing around with, is I love this idea of sigil creation based on the positions of tarot. So a lot of people throw freeform spreads depending on the direction of focus of the main characters within the cards. So you could take that further and essentially throw a spread, track the directions of the eye movements, and draw it all out and create a form of grid. Look at where those lines intersect, what cards those intersections fall on. Continue to delve deeper into that, any kind of geometry that emerges from the spread itself, and that you can draw freehand while you're doing your read. Other perks. Other perks of this include the fact that, one, it's a hell of a lot more subtle to pull these out at a cafe than your Rider-Waite. You don't necessarily want to be subtle, but if you do, people are going to look over and just see not terribly obvious cards. Now, obviously, this works less well if you've written all over them, as I have here, but let's say you go even more subtle with the majors than I have, you're essentially going to look like you're just pulling out a bunch of playing cards, and no one will really think twice about it. So if you're a little bit closeted, that can be handy. I like the size of a standard playing card, frankly, and since there's no imagery, you're not really sacrificing being able to see the beautiful artwork on the front of the card. And plastic has a level of durability that paper does not, and so I expect these cards to be with me considerably longer. So these are just a few things I wanted to bring up regarding this deck. I wanted to share this just because I think it's a cute idea, obviously, that's why I'm doing it, but also because I adore the tarot, and expanding in new directions and playing with new things is something that I'm quite passionate about and I long for. So I wanted to share my ideas regarding what I'm doing now. One thing I will say is that this probably isn't the right route if you are a brand spanking new beginner. You do want to have imagery of the card, and I do mean imagery. I don't think it would be ideal to merely have a few keywords in your head. I think it's really helpful to be able to call up the visual imagery associated with individual cards from at least one deck, and to be able to do that with high fidelity. Although there's nothing to say that you can't write a form of cheat sheet, as I have, for instance, with the majors, just by including the title of the major. There's nothing to say you couldn't do that on all the cards. So for your Eight of Wands, for instance, you could just jot movement down the side in order to remind you that, ah yes, that is the Rider-Waite card with all the staffs flying through the air. But if you do have a decent amount of experience with the tarot, I think you would be surprised at how easily you can transition to something like this. Now, it might take just a couple weeks to get used to it, but your recall of the deck is probably better than you would right off the bat assume it was. So I definitely would encourage anybody, even if you're a little scared of trying something like this, to just give it a shot, because I think it is going to provide me with a level of flexibility that otherwise I wouldn't have. And I look forward to playing with it and finding out how to do new things with my modifiable tarot deck. If anybody has fun ideas for me, I more than welcome them. So until next time, thank you for watching. Have a lovely night.